Hi everybody, this is Mr. Nolan, and what we're going to do today is start moving in a new direction with our Junco investigation. We will review some Junco behavior really quickly, and we're going to learn about foraging behavior in another model organism that we're going to start looking at over the next day or two, which has to do with novelty-seeking, and so we'll talk about what that is. There's some questions that I want you to look at in your student activity sheets, but really the point of today is to be able to start looking forward to how would we set up an investigation for our Juncos that we can use to figure out if their behaviors are inherited or if they are learned. If they're inherited, what that basically means is that there's some kind of genetics involved. If it's learned, what it means is that the Juncos are born, and then they figure out how to have this behavior later. So that's really sort of the object today, is to figure out, how can we set that up. So before we go any further, if you do not have your student activity sheets, you're going to want those. We're on 76 through 78, so you can look at that in the information section of the video, or you can go to my website. You'll also want an article. There's a Scouting in Honeybees article that we're going to look at that you're going to want to have access to as well. You can find it on Google Docs, or again, you can go to my website. So let's kind of review what we saw in our Juncos. What do we know about the populations? We've got our mountain birds and we have our UCSD birds. And what we found was that the UCSD birds will allow humans to get much, much closer before flight initiation distance, so before the bird flies away. Foraging birds will let you get within about 4 meters if they're UCSD birds, and nesting females will let you get within about 40 centimeters, so you can get really close to a bird before it flies away. That's the ones on campus. The mountain birds fly away when you're really already far, you're still far away from them. We've also seen from figure 11A.3 over here, that this is actually taking place over many generations, that the change isn't happening necessarily in a really short time. It's taking place over a long period of time, so like many generations. So what our question today is, why? How? Why does a bird fly away, at this distance instead of that distance? Is it their genes, or are they learning this? So that's sort of the object today, is to start kind of putting some ideas together about how could we set up an investigation. So what are some other organisms that we can use to learn about our Juncos? They would probably be organisms that are also responding to stimuli that we can observe visually, maybe that we can trap, and maybe do some testing on those organisms. And so a really excellent organism that we can use is honeybees. So honeybees actually have undergone extensive research over the past 100 or even 200 years. Scientists have always been interested in how they do what they do. So honeybees are really exciting because an individual honeybee is very dumb, yet the hive is able to sustain itself. It's able to pull in all these calories, all this food, all this energy, and all these resources that keeps this hive alive. And so it's a really very sophisticated environment inside that hive. We have bees that are doing all kinds of different jobs. We have some bees whose job is to go out and look for different resources. We have other bees whose job is basically they're just the grunts. They go out and they harvest resources that have already been found. So bees are really an interesting research subject, because what we can do is we can take bees that are behaving in certain ways, and we can test them and try to figure out, were they born that way, or did they learn this somehow? So we're going to be looking into bees and see, can we use what we know about bees in order to investigate Juncos? So how can we conduct an investigation is what we're going to talk about today. So let's talk a little bit about bees. So bees have, in fact, lots of animals have a kind of behavior that's called novelty-seeking behavior. Novelty-seeking, what that means, this idea of novelty-seeking, is that you seek new things. That if you're an animal that notices something in its environment that looks a little off, you say, gee, I'm going to go take a look at that. So you can find novelty seeking in cats and dogs, animals that are interested, that are curious about what is this new thing in my environment. So if you give a cat or a dog a new toy, or if a person that they don't know, visits or something, they're likely to be kind of curious about them. That's essentially novelty seeking. What we see in bees, as far as novelty seeking, is that they will search out new food resources, because these bees need to go find flowers and other sources of nectar. They really need to pay attention to when are flowers blooming, and then maybe if that resource is exhausted or disappears, they have to go find a new resource fast. So bees have novelty seeking. They have to look for these new resources in order to stay alive. And so there's really different kinds of foraging bees. There are bees that are called scouts, and these scouts go and look for new resources. They are novelty seeking. And then there are the non-scouts. The non-scouts don't look for new things. All they do is the scout goes, finds a resource, comes back to the hive and does his little waggle dance, and he tells the other bees, okay, go there, you're gonna find some, flowers, that are great over in that direction, at a certain distance. So the scout goes, finds it, and then the non-scout just goes and harvests. So there's these two different kind of classes of worker bees. And our question here is really, what is causing the difference between the scouts and the non-scouts? If we can figure that out, that might give us an idea of what can we do with our juncos to figure out what the difference is. And then we want to see, if we can use this methodology and extend this to our juncos. So before we go any further, I want you to find the Scouting Honeybees article on my website, or click on the link down here. Go there and read through it. And what I'd like you to do is to go ahead and answer some questions in your student activity sheets. They start right here where it says Lesson 11B. How do scientists determine if a behavioral trait is an instinct or born with it or not, or if it's learned? So I do want you to go through here, and I want you to actually read the article. And I want you to try to answer these questions all the way from 76 through to 78. And after you've done that, you can watch the rest of this video, and I'll kind of talk to you about what are these researchers saying is going on with our scouting bees and our non-scouting bees, and what can we find out about that, and then how can we extend that to juncos. So at this moment, please pause the video, read the article, and we will go from there. Okay, now that you have read that article and gone through it and tried to answer some of those questions in your student activity sheets, let me kind of talk to you about how this experiment is set up. So if you look at the screen here, what the researchers are trying to do is figure out what is the difference, what's causing the difference between our scout bees and our non-scout bees. So I'm going to show you how they set up this experiment. So this is Liang and others. It's a 2012 paper, and they're trying to explain how this works. So we've got our beehive, okay? So we've got our bees buzzing around, and what happens is they take this beehive and they put what's called a training feeder over in one corner of an enclosure. The bees have to stay in the enclosure. There's no other resources. All they have is the training feeder. So there's nectar, there's food inside the training feeder. And so what they do, the bees get used to going to that training feeder. And so they will visit that feeder over the course of the day. And so they learn, that colony learns there's the food. Well, then what they do is the next day, the researchers put in a new feeder in addition to the training feeder. And so what happens is that at the beginning of the day, what they notice is that there are bees that are going to the training feeder, and then there are also a few bees that are going to the novel feeder, the new feeder. And then they will collect those bees going to the feeder. Those bees are the scout bees. The bees that are visiting the new feeder on that first day are the scout bees. The non-scouts won't go to that new feeder yet. Maybe the next day they will, but they won't go to the new feeder. The non-scouts are just going to go visit what they already know. The next day, the researchers will put out another feeder, and, over the course of the day, they'll find that there are some more bees that are visiting that different novel feeder. Again, those are the scouts. The next day, they put out a new feeder, and then give that a little while, and those bees that visit the new feeder are the scouts. Meanwhile, those bees that keep going to the old feeder, this red one, the training feeder, those are the non-scouts. So this is the whole point. This is the way that the researchers set this up, is they just set these different feeders in different locations and just watch what bees went to the new feeder. If a bee went to the new feeder, it means that that bee has novelty-seeking behavior. That's the idea. So now the researchers can collect those scout bees, those novelty-seeking behavior bees, and they can analyze them genetically. They can do all kinds of silly things to those bees in order to figure out what is really the difference between these bees. And so that's what they asked, was what is the difference between these bees? There's a lot of complicated biochemistry and genetics and all sorts of things that we could get into, but essentially what it comes down to, what is the difference between the scouts and the non-scouts? Well, they look the same, right? You can't tell by looking at them that they're any different, but the non-scouts have a different brain chemistry than the scouts. There are different genes that are lighting up in the scout and non-scout brains. Don't worry about exactly the details behind these genes and chemicals, but what's important to recognize is that the bees that are born as scouts will exhibit scouting behavior for pretty much their whole lives. The bees that are born as non-scouts will pretty much never be scouts. Doesn't matter what situation you force them into. They're pretty much going to act the same way. And so what is this supposed to mean? Well, it probably means that these behaviors, this novelty-seeking, is something that the bees are born with. It has to do with either their genes or the expression of their genes, which genes are lighting up. So there's something actually in the organism itself that is causing these bees to behave differently. It's not like they learn it from the queen bee or they learn it from their experiences. They're born and they're in a situation and they're going to behave in that situation because they're kind of like programmed, kind of like little robots. Not to be demeaning to bees, but that's basically what they are. So scouts and non-scouts, there's chemical differences between scouts and non-scouts. This seems significant because if we can observe this in another organism, maybe if we observe the same thing in juncos, that can tell us something about why certain populations of juncos behave in different ways. Why do some juncos let people get really close within a few centimeters and other populations take off when you're still a few meters away? This is really interesting. So what I want you to start thinking about, and the last question in the student activity sheets asks you to do this, can you think of a way to extend our methodology of our bees, this enclosure where we've got these, the scouting behavior going on, the training feeder and the novel feeder, can you imagine a way that we can take the same logic, the same idea, and to take our birds and to say, well, what can we do with our birds, with our juncos, to try to figure out, okay, bird, are you born letting people get close to you, or do you learn that from your parents or from other birds or something? So I want you to use your imagination. Imagine you've got $10,000 and a bunch of assistants and several years in order to do a study at UCSD in the mountains. What could you do? What could you actually set up? What experiment could you do in order to try to answer this question in the juncos? Are they born this way, or do they learn this? So that's what we're going to be talking about in our next lesson. So if you were not here today, or if you struggled with what was going on, please go ahead and do that in your activity sheets, and we will keep going from there. So I hope that you start to get some ideas about how can we actually use the same methodology, a similar methodology, for our juncos in order to answer the same question. Are they born this way, or are they learning these behaviors? So until next time, happy hunting.